Space is silent, but the approach of death is deafening. When the alien armada cracked our final defensive grid, survival odds flatlined to 0. No reinforcements, no hope. Until the radar pinged. A single human dreadnought, missing for a decade, just tore a hole in reality. Brace yourselves. The telemetry screens inside Outpost Echo flickered with the dying gasps of the 7th Fleet. Commander Arthur Briggs stood motionless before the primary tactical holotable. The harsh, synthetic blue light carving deep ravines of exhaustion into his weathered face. He didn't blink. Blinking meant looking away, and looking away felt like a betrayal to the thousands of men and women currently turning into ash and frozen dust just 300,000 kilometers away. "Report," Briggs demanded, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that betrayed the tightness in his throat. Lieutenant Simon Riley, his chief tactical officer, hesitated. Riley was 24, fresh out of the Annapolis Aerospace Academy, and possessed a mind sharp enough to calculate orbital mechanics in his head. Right now, however, that brilliant mind was struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated slaughter unfolding on his monitors. "Sir," Riley began, swallowing hard, "the UNS Dauntless has gone dark. Admiral Hayes' transponder signal is, 'It's gone, sir.' The core detonation took out 2 of the enemy's Vanguard cruisers, but the remaining hostile fleet has stabilized their formation. They are advancing." Briggs gripped the edges of the holotable. The cold steel bit into his palms. The enemy, a hostile collective humanity simply referred to as the Covenant of Gnosis, or just the Swarm by the grunts on the ground, had appeared out of deep space 6 months ago. They didn't communicate, they didn't negotiate, they simply arrived, possessing energy shielding and plasma weaponry that made humanity's railguns and nuclear torpedoes look like flintlock pistols. Outpost Echo was supposed to be the impregnable anchor of Sector 7. Co-developed by the United Nations Space Command and a consortium of private defense contractors, chiefly Lockheed Martin's Deep Space Division and BAE Systems, the station was an armoured fortress bristling with tungsten slug rail batteries and localized magnetic deflector shields. It was meant to hold the line. It was meant to be the shield behind which Earth could rally. Instead, it was a tomb in waiting. "Status of the civilian evacuation transports?" Briggs asked, forcing his eyes away from the expanding debris field where the Dauntless had just perished. "Transports Liberty and Mayflower are spooling up their slip space drives," reported Communications Officer Sarah Jenkins. Her hands flew across her terminal, rerouting auxiliary power to the station's broadcast arrays. But they need another 20 minutes to achieve minimum jump calculation vectors. If they jump blind, the gravitational shear from the nearby gas giant will tear them apart. "They don't have 20 minutes, Riley whispered. The young lieutenant pointed a trembling finger at the tactical display. A massive constellation of crimson blips had reoriented themselves from the wreckage of the human fleet. The Swarm's vessels were jagged, asymmetrical nightmares of dark metal and pulsing violet energy. They didn't follow standard aerodynamic or zero-G aesthetic principles. They looked like obsidian daggers driven into the fabric of space. "Enemy dreadnoughts are charging their main spinal batteries," Riley reported, his voice cracking. "Targeting telemetry confirms they have a lock on Outpost Echo. Thermal spikes detected. Sir, if those plasma lances hit our deflectors, the magnetic coils will overload in seconds. The station will be breached." Briggs let out a slow, measured breath. He had spent 30 years in the service. He had survived the Martian insurrections, the Europa pirate campaigns, and the grueling Cold War of the outer colonies. He had always known that the end might come in the cold, unforgiving vacuum of space. But he had never imagined it would be this absolute, this final. "Route all life support and gravity generators from decks 4 through 9, Briggs ordered, his tone suddenly devoid of emotion. "Feed every volt of electricity we have into the forward deflector arrays. Give those transports their 20 minutes. Even if we have to burn this station's core to slag, those civilians get out of here." "Yes, Commander," Jenkins replied, her fingers flying over the console. The deck vibrated beneath their boots as massive power conduits shifted the station's lifeblood toward the defensive grid. On the holotable, the Crimson Fleet closed the distance. The swarm was methodical. They didn't rush. They knew the prey was trapped. They formed a crescent wall, cutting off any trajectory for the evacuation transports, ensuring that when the station fell, nothing would escape. "Time to impact?" Briggs asked. 2 minutes, Riley said. "They're entering optimal firing range." The silence on the command deck was heavy, suffocating. The klaxons had been muted. There was no point in blaring alarms when everyone already knew they were dead. The crew exchanged quiet, lingering glances. Some gripped the edges of their stations. Others pulled out worn photographs of families back on Earth, pressing their thumbs over the smiling faces of people they would never see again. "It's been an honor, Commander," Riley said quietly, not looking away from the screen. Briggs walked over and placed a heavy hand on the young man's shoulder. "The honor was mine, Lieutenant. You did good today." Outside the massive reinforced permaglass viewport, the darkness of space began to glow with a sickly, malevolent violet hue. The swarm's spinal weapons were fully charged. Death was a certainty. But then the universe shuddered. "Commander!" Jenkins shouted, the sudden sharpness in her voice shattering the solemn quiet of the bridge. "I'm getting a massive gravitational fluctuation. It's right on top of us." Briggs spun around, his brow furrowing. "Other transports jumping early. I gave strict orders." "It's not the transports, sir," Riley interrupted, his hands frantically dancing across his sensory readouts. "It's coming from outside the station, between us and the swarm fleet. Sir, it's a slip-space rupture, but the energy signature is completely off the charts. It's tearing the local space-time fabric apart." Through the viewport, the violet glow of the enemy weapons was suddenly overshadowed by a blinding flash of pure, searing white light. The vacuum of space didn't carry sound, but the sheer gravitational displacement sent a shockwave of kinetic energy rippling through Outpost Echo. The massive station groaned, metal stressing and bulkheads protesting as an artificial gravity violently manifested just 50 kilometers off their starboard bow. A swirling, jagged vortex of cerulean energy ripped open in the dark. It wasn't the clean, mathematically precise tear of a modern human slip-space jump, nor was it the instantaneous flash of swarm technology. This was violent. It looked like someone had taken a crowbar to the laws of physics and prayed reality open by brute force. "Radiation spikes!" Riley yelled over the suddenly reactivated warning klaxons. "Gamma radiation, Cherenkov radiation, exotic particle decay. Sir, whatever is coming through that portal is practically radioactive." From the center of the blinding vortex, a shadow emerged. It was massive, eclipsing the stars behind it. As the vortex violently collapsed inward, dissipating the blinding light, the sheer scale of the arrival became apparent. It was a ship, but it didn't look like anything currently in the United Nations Space Command registry. It was a jagged, brutalist slab of dark grey armor plating, scarred with deep thermal gouges and carbon scoring. It had no sleek lines, no aerodynamic concessions. It was built like a flying anvil, bristling with an absurd number of weapon emplacements, missile pods, and massive protruding kinetic acceleration rails. "Identify that vessel," Briggs demanded, his heart hammering against his ribs. Riley stared at his screen, his jaw dropping. He hit the refresh key, then he hit it again. "Sir, the IFF transponder is old, like pre-coalition old. The encryption codes matched DARPA Project 7. Briggs felt a chill crawl up his spine. DARPA Project 7 was a ghost story, a myth traded among academy cadets in hushed tones after lights out. In the late 2080s, when humanity first began testing deep space combat vessels, there was a black site project spearheaded by the most brilliant minds at Northrop Grumman and the military's experimental division. They built a ship meant to be a planet killer, a vessel so heavily armed and armoured it could break sieges single-handedly. "Give me a name, Lieutenant," Briggs said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Transponder confirms," Riley gulped. "It's the UNS Oppenheimer." "That's impossible," Jenkins breathed, staring at the looming dreadnought. "The Oppenheimer was lost 15 years ago in the Orion Nebula." The official report said the core went critical and vaporized the crew. Captain Nathaniel Rook and 300 sailors. They've been dead for a decade and a half. It's not a ghost, Jenkins, Briggs said, stepping closer to the glass. The UNS Oppenheimer hung in the void, a silent leviathan between Outpost Echo and the swarm armada. It didn't emit a single radio transmission. There were no running lights, no thruster burns to stabilize its orbit. It just drifted, cold and dark, like a corpse dredged up from the deepest ocean trench. Yet the swarm fleet had paused. The crimson blips on the tactical map halted their advance. The violet glow of their charging spinal weapons dimmed slightly as their targeting sensors tried to comprehend the massive, heavily armoured anomaly that had just violently shoved its way into the battlefield. "Are we receiving any communications?" Briggs asked. "A hail? A distress beacon? Anything?" "Nothing, sir," Jenkins replied, her hands shaking over her headset. "I'm broadcasting on all wideband and secure channels, command frequencies, emergency bands, even old Morse code channels. Total radio silence. Thermal imaging shows the ship's outer hull is at near absolute zero. Life signs?" Riley shook his head slowly. "None. Internal biometric scanners are bouncing off heavy lead-lined bulkheads, but the ambient temperature inside that ship is negative 80 degrees Celsius. Sir, there is no life support running. Nothing biological could survive in there." Briggs narrowed his eyes. "Then who is flying the ship?" Before anyone could answer, the tactical holotable flared a vibrant, angry red. The swarm had finished analysing the new arrival. Dismissing the Oppenheimer as dead debris or a desperate, failed human trick, the enemy fleet redirected their primary spinal weapons. "Swarm Vanguard is firing!" Riley screamed. 5 beams of concentrated, hyper-accelerated plasma tore across the vacuum of space, illuminating the dark void in blinding violet. They were aimed squarely at the broadside of the UNS Oppenheimer. "Impact in 3 seconds," Riley counted down. 2, 1. Briggs braced himself, expecting the ancient human ship to be caught out and vaporized in a spectacular explosion of metal and fire. Plasma lances burned at temperatures exceeding the core of a star. No human armor plating, especially 15-year-old technology, could withstand a direct hit. The plasma beams struck the Oppenheimer. The visual flare was blinding. The crew of Outpost Echo shielded their eyes as a secondary shockwave rattled their reinforced glass. When the harsh light faded, Briggs forced his eyes open, expecting to see a cloud of expanding wreckage. Instead, he saw a monster waking up. The Oppenheimer had not moved. It had not raised energy shields. It didn't have any. The plasma lancers had struck the hull directly. The ablative armor plating was boiling, glowing a furious molten orange, slagging off in massive chunks into the void. But the ship itself remained unbroken. "Armor integrity is at 80%, Riley whispered in absolute disbelief. "Sir, the hull plating on that thing, it's not standard titanium or carbon nanotube. It's dense. It's incredibly dense. It just ate 5 plasma lances and barely flinched." Deep within the dark, silent husk of the UNS Oppenheimer, something shifted. A low resonant hum began to vibrate through the comms channels, a sound that bypassed the audio receivers and seemed to rattle the very teeth of the bridge crew. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a reactor, monstrous in scale, coming online. Along the massive spine of the dreadnought, a series of colossal magnetic coils began to glow with a terrifying, aggressive crimson light. "Sir," Jenkins said, her voice dropping into a register of pure awe, "I think they're angry." The UNS Oppenheimer did not issue a warning. It did not broadcast a declaration of war. It simply retaliated with a level of ferocity that defied military doctrine. "Energy spikes detected along the anomaly's dorsal ridge," Riley shouted, his fingers gripping the edge of his console. "Massive power draw. They're charging railguns, but, sir, the telemetry doesn't make sense. The magnetic acceleration loops are pulling more amperage than a planetary grid." Briggs watched the holotable as the dark dreadnought came alive. The red glow along its spine intensified, bathing the surrounding space in the colour of dried blood. The swarm fleet, perhaps realizing their initial barrage had failed to neutralize the target, began to reposition. Their sleek obsidian cruisers broke formation, attempting to flank the lumbering human behemoth. They didn't make it. Without a sound, the Oppenheimer fired. It wasn't a sustained beam of energy. It was a purely kinetic strike, launched with such localized gravitational force that the recoil actually pushed the massive dreadnought backward a few kilometers. A solid slug of depleted uranium and tungsten, roughly the size of a city bus, crossed the distance between the Oppenheimer and the swarm vanguard at 0.04% the speed of light. The lead swarm dreadnought, a vessel that had effortlessly absorbed nuclear torpedoes from the Dauntless an hour prior, was struck dead center. The kinetic impact was so catastrophic that the enemy ship's energy shielding didn't even register the hit. The shield collapsed instantly under the sheer mathematical impossibility of the kinetic energy transferred. The tungsten slug punched through the bow of the swarm vessel, ripped through its internal decks, shattered its plasma core, and exited the stern in a fraction of a millisecond. The swarm dreadnought didn't just explode, it shattered like glass hit by a sledgehammer. A silent, blinding shockwave of violently expanding debris and ignited plasma bloomed in the dark. "Target destroyed," Riley breathed, his eyes wide. "One shot, sir. They just killed a swarm dreadnought with one shot." But the Oppenheimer was only getting started. The massive human warship began to move. It didn't maneuver with the slow, graceful banking typical of heavy cruisers. It utilized maneuvering thrusters with such violent concussive bursts that the G-forces inside the ship would have pulverized a human crew into paste. It pivoted on its axis with sickening speed, bringing its broadside batteries to bear on the flanking swarm cruisers. "Missile bays open in," Jenkins reported. Hundreds of heavy silo doors along the Oppenheimer's flanks snapped open. A swarm of missiles erupted from the ship, leaving trails of thick white exhaust in the vacuum. But these weren't standard heat-seeking or radar-guided munitions. "Telemetry shows those warheads are unguided, sir," Riley said, confusion lacing his voice. "They're just flying straight into the void." Briggs watched closely. "Wait, watch the detonation sequence." The missiles flew into the empty space between the swarm ships. Then, simultaneously, they detonated. Not with fire, but with terrifying localized gravity wells. The space around the swarm fleet rippled. "Micro-singularity warheads," Briggs whispered, the color draining from his face. It was a weapon banned by the Geneva Space Accords in 2075. The warheads created temporary localized black holes that lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The sheer gravitational shear caught 3 swarm cruisers in its grip. The sleek obsidian ships were violently yanked off their trajectories, their internal gyros screaming as they were pulled toward the artificial gravity well. They slammed into one another in a horrific collision of rending metal and collapsing shields. Before the swarm could recover from the spatial disruption, the Oppenheimer plunged directly into the chaotic debris field. "They're breaking all engagement distances," Riley said in a panic. "They're moving into point-blank range. Sir, no ship can survive that close to a swarm plasma battery." The swarm commanders seemed to realize the same thing. The surviving vessels unleashed a frantic, concentrated barrage of plasma fire. Violet beams and searing energy torpedoes hammered the Oppenheimer from all sides. The human dreadnought's armor boiled. Massive chunks of the outer hull were torn away, exposing the dark, skeletal substructure beneath. Secondary explosions rippled across its surface, but it didn't slow down. It was a machine possessed by a singular, unyielding purpose: eradication. The Oppenheimer rammed the nearest swarm-heavy cruiser. The kinetic transfer buckled the Outpost Echo's sensors. The reinforced prow of the human ship, heavily modified with a tungsten carbide ramming shield, cleaved straight through the midsection of the alien vessel. The swarm cruiser was snapped in half, its bleeding plasma core sputtering out into the cold vacuum as the Oppenheimer bulldozed through its remains. This isn't possible," Briggs muttered, stepping right up to the permaglass viewport, mesmerized by the sheer brutality of the engagement. No human crew can coordinate strikes with that level of precision while under a 360-degree barrage. The reaction times are down to milliseconds. Who is commanding that vessel? Jenkins swallowed hard, pressing her hand against her earpiece. Commander, I'm getting a signal. It's not on the comms frequencies. It's bleeding over into our data streams. It's a massive data packet transmitting from the Oppenheimer directly into our mainframe. Is it a virus? Shut down the external networks, Briggs ordered. No, sir. It's not an attack. It's a broadcast. Jenkins rapidly typed on her keyboard, routing the data through the station's primary audio synthesizers. I'm putting it on speakers. The bridge filled with static. It was harsh, grating, sounding like grinding metal and digital white noise. But slowly the static began to coalesce. It organized itself into an acoustic pattern. It formed voices, not one voice, hundreds. They spoke in perfect, chilling unison. The sound was metallic, devoid of breath or biological hesitation, yet underneath the digital distortion lay an unmistakable, deep-seated human fury. We are the crew of the United Nations ship Oppenheimer. The voice vibrated through the deck plating. Riley covered his ears, wincing at the sheer auditory pressure. 15 years ago, our physical forms perished in the fires of the Orion Nebula, but our duty did not end. DARPA Protocol Phoenix initiated. Our minds were integrated into the ship's cortex. We are no longer flesh. We are the hull. We are the guns. We are the engine. Briggs stared at the heavily damaged dreadnought outside. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Captain Nathaniel Rook and his 300 crew members hadn't died. When their life support failed, the experimental AI core of the ship had forcibly uploaded their neural patterns to save their consciousnesses. They had spent 15 years trapped in the dark, cold digital void of the ship's mainframe. 15 years of isolation. 15 years of becoming one with the most lethal war machine humanity had ever built. They weren't a crew anymore. They were the ship. We detected the distress signal from Sector 7. The unified mechanical chorus echoed through the bridge. We have returned to fulfill our directive, defend humanity, exterminate all threats. Outside, the Oppenheimer turned its battered, scarred bulk toward the remaining swarm flagship. Half of its exterior was slagged, venting atmospheric gases and coolant into space, but the crimson glow of its weapon systems only burned brighter. Brace yourselves! Outpost Echo! Captain Rook's voice, or the digital amalgamation that remained of him, spoke above the rest. We are taking out the trash. The swarm flagship was a nightmare of Euclidean geometry, a jagged obsidian spire roughly the size of Manhattan. Officially designated by UNSC threat assessment algorithms as a Leviathan-class dreadnought, it boasted enough firepower to crack a planetary crust. Until this moment, it had lingered at the rear of the alien formation, a silent overseer to the slaughter of the human fleet. Now, with its vanguard pulverized by a 15-year-old ghost ship, the flagship was forced into the fray. Aboard Outpost Echo, the command center was bathed in the harsh, flashing red of proximity warnings. Commander Arthur Briggs stood rigidly by the holotable, watching the telemetry data flood in. "Sir, the swarm flagship is advancing," Lieutenant Simon Riley reported, his voice tight. "They're bypassing the debris field. Energy readings are spiking across their forward hull. They're charging a resonance weapon. If that hits the Oppenheimer, it won't matter how thick their armor is. The harmonic frequency will vibrate the ship's molecular structure until it liquefies." "Time to firing parameters?" Briggs asked. 30 seconds. Briggs looked at the UNS Oppenheimer. The ancient dreadnought was a battered mess. Its General Dynamics polyalloy armor was sloughing off in molten sheets, and deep glowing thermal scars crisscrossed its hull. Yet, it didn't retreat. It didn't even attempt to evade. Instead, the Oppenheimer began to accelerate directly toward the swarm flagship. "What is Captain Rook doing?" Communications Officer Sarah Jenkins whispered. "They can't outrun a resonance beam." Inside the Oppenheimer, there was no bridge. There were no flashing consoles, no frantic officers shouting orders, no smell of sweat and ozone. There was only the cold, absolute zero of the mainframe and the blazing, blinding speed of a neural network operating at light speed. 300 human minds, preserved and fused into the ship's architecture by an experimental DARPA protocol, functioned as a single, terrifying organism. Captain Nathaniel Rook was the ego, the central processor, but he felt the presence of his crew in every subsystem. He didn't issue verbal commands, he thought them, and the ship responded. Chief Engineer Miller was the Pratt & Whitney fusion torch, regulating the monstrous heat of the engines. Tactical Officer Bradley was the Palantir predictive targeting matrix, calculating millions of spatial variables per microsecond. They didn't just fly the ship, they inhabited it. The enemy is charging a harmonic disruptor, Bradley's thought echoed through the collective consciousness. Impact probability is 99.9%. Reroute auxiliary power to the forward magnetic rams, Rook commanded. Miller, blow the safety limiters on the port thrusters. Give me a 60-degree yaw. The Oppenheimer violently shuddered. In the vacuum of space, the colossal dreadnought performed a maneuver that would have instantly liquefied a biological crew. It snapped sideways, presenting its heavily armoured port flank to the advancing flagship, while simultaneously firing its main thrusters at 140% of their rated capacity. The swarm flagship fired. A pulsating pale green wave of harmonic energy tore through the void. It struck the Oppenheimer's port side. On Outpost Echo, Riley gasped as the tactical display screamed in protest. Direct hit! The Oppenheimer's hull integrity is dropping 40%, 30%. The harmonic resonance chewed through the ablative plating, violently shaking the human dreadnought. But Rook and his crew had anticipated the physics of the weapon. By presenting their flank and maintaining maximum forward thrust, they were shedding the vibrating armor plating before the harmonic frequency could reach the ship's internal superstructure. They were literally peeling off their own skin to survive the blast. Damage control! Rook's voice barked across the encrypted UN channel, bleeding into Outpost Echo speakers. Seal bulkheads 4 through 12. Let the armor go! The Oppenheimer punched through the dissipating green energy wave, leaving a massive trail of its own shattered, vibrating armor behind it. Its port side was skeletal, exposing the dark, heavy machinery of its internal decks, but its core remained intact. The swarm commander, likely realizing the kinetic impossibility of what the human ship had just survived, panicked. The flagship launched boarding pods, hundreds of jagged, needle-like boarding crafts meant to pierce a ship's hull and deploy hordes of cybernetic shock troops to slaughter the crew. The needles struck the exposed flank of the Oppenheimer, burying themselves deep into the unarmored decks. "Commander Briggs," Jenkins shouted, "the Oppenheimer has been boarded, multiple hull breaches detected, the swarm is inside the ship." Briggs clenched his jaw. Standard UNSC protocol for a mass boarding event was to initiate internal lockdown and deploy marine contingents, but the Oppenheimer had no marines. It had no internal defences. It was a metal tomb. "They're going to tear the ship apart from the inside," Riley said, his hands hovering uselessly over his console. But across the comms, the collective digitized voice of the Oppenheimer's crew let out a sound that chilled everyone on the bridge. It was a dark, synthetic laugh. "They came looking for flesh," the voice resonated, heavy with metallic amusement. "Let them find the cold." Inside the Oppenheimer, the swarm shock troops burst from their pods. They were towering, multi-limbed nightmares of biomechanical engineering, armed with plasma cutters and neural whips. They flooded the corridors, their thermal optics scanning frantically for human heat signatures. They found nothing. The ambient temperature was negative 80 degrees Celsius. There was no oxygen. There was no gravity. Before the swarm troops could orient themselves, the Oppenheimer's internal defense protocols, rewritten by the crew's neural algorithms, activated. The blast doors slammed shut, sealing the borders inside the portside corridors. Suddenly, the internal localized magnetic fields powered by old Anduril Industries autonomous combat nodes violently reversed polarity. The swarm troops were slammed against the ceiling with the force of 10 Gs, their biomechanical joints snapping under the sudden gravitational crush. Then the ship vented its own excess reactor plasma directly into the sealed corridors. The temperature spiked from absolute 0 to 4,000 degrees in a fraction of a second. The boarding party wasn't just killed, They were incinerated, reduced to drifting clouds of carbon and molten slag within their own boarding tubes. "Boarding party neutralized," Rook's voice echoed through the comms. "Bradley, plot a course straight down their throat." The Oppenheimer, bleeding atmosphere and trailing fire, reoriented. It was now within 50 kilometers of the swarm flagship, point-blank range for capital ships. "Sir," Riley said, staring at his monitors in sheer disbelief, "the Oppenheimer is spooling its slip space drive, but they aren't calculating a jump vector. They're dumping the raw exotic matter directly into their forward deflector dish." Briggs's eyes widened as he realized what the ghost ship was about to do. They're weaponizing the jump drive. They're going to tear a hole in space right inside the enemy ship. "If they do that, the gravitational feedback will rip the Oppenheimer in half," Jenkins cried out. On the holotable, the colossal swarm flagship realized its peril. It desperately tried to engage its reverse thrusters, its massive engines burning violet in the dark. But it was too late. The Oppenheimer had locked onto them with the grim, inescapable grip of a dead man. The front of the human dreadnought began to glow with a blinding, terrifying cerulean light. The fabric of reality groaned. For the dauntless, for Earth, for the dead. The collective voices of the 300 uploaded souls screamed through the radio static. The Oppenheimer fired its slip space anomaly. The explosion was completely silent, yet it felt as though the universe itself had shattered. From Outpost Echo's vantage point, it didn't look like a standard kinetic or thermonuclear detonation. It was a localized collapse of physics. The Oppenheimer's weaponized jump drive tore a jagged dimensional rift directly inside the swarm flagship's plasma core. For a single, agonizing microsecond, the massive obsidian dreadnought seemed to fold in on itself, its dark metal twisting into impossible geometric shapes as the artificial singularity devoured its mass. Then, the containment field failed entirely. The resulting shockwave of displaced space-time and ignited plasma erupted outward. A sphere of pure, blinding white energy expanded across the void, incinerating the remaining swarm cruisers caught in its blast radius. The light was so intense that the permaglass viewport on Outpost Echo auto-darkened to maximum opacity, and the crew was thrown to the deck as the station's magnetic shield screamed under the kinetic pressure. When the light finally faded and the station's artificial gravity stabilized, Briggs pulled himself up using the edge of the holotable. "Status!" he roared, coughing as smoke from an overloaded console filled the air. "Shields held at 9%, sir," Riley gasped, scrambling back into his chair. His hands moved frantically over the keyboard. Station structural integrity is compromised on decks 4 and 5, but life support is stable. The transports Liberty and Mayflower are untouched. They've halted their jump sequences. "The swarm fleet?" Briggs asked, staring out the viewport at the swirling cloud of superheated dust and debris. "Gone, sir," Jenkins said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. "Sensors are clear. The flagship was completely annihilated. The remaining cruisers were caught in the gravitational shear. There's nothing left but scrap." The command center fell deadly silent. The impossible had happened. A fleet that had slaughtered Earth's finest armada had been entirely eradicated by a single dead ship. "Lieutenant," Briggs said slowly, his eyes scanning the debris field. "Where is the Oppenheimer?" Riley adjusted the sensor sweeps, pushing through the heavy radiation interference left by the singularity blast. For a long, tense moment there was nothing. Then, a massive, jagged shadow drifted out from behind the expanding cloud of wreckage. The UNS Oppenheimer was barely recognizable as a ship. Its entire forward section was a mangled, molten wreck. The weaponized jump drive had exacted a terrible toll. The gravitational feedback had sheared off the prow, exposing massive internal superstructures to the vacuum. Entire decks were gone. The crimson glow of its weapon coils flickered erratically, like the fading heartbeat of a dying beast. "I have them on scopes," Riley whispered. "Sir, they took catastrophic damage. Their primary reactor is bleeding containment. They have maybe 10 minutes before the core melts down completely." Jenkins, Open a direct channel, Briggs ordered, straightening his uniform. He felt a profound, overwhelming sense of reverence. Captain Rook, this is Commander Arthur Briggs of Outpost Echo. Do you copy? The radio hissed with heavy, grinding static. For a moment, Briggs feared the internal systems of the ghost ship had finally failed. But then, a voice broke through. It was no longer the terrifying unified chorus of 300 minds. The immense damage to the ship's neural architecture had fractured the collective. Only one voice remained clear, the deep, exhausted tone of Captain Nathaniel Rook. "We hear you, Outpost Echo," Rook's digital voice rasped, glitching slightly with electronic distortion. "Threat neutralized. Sector 7 is secure. Captain, your vessel is sustaining critical containment failure," Briggs said, stepping closer to the comms array. "We are deploying heavy repair drones and tether lines. We can tow you to the station. We have state-of-the-art server farms here. We can download your neural patterns into our mainframe before the ship's core goes critical. We can save you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Negative, Commander," Rook replied. The artificial voice carried a heavy, melancholic weight. "Our code is fundamentally integrated into the ship's hardware. The DARPA neural link cannot be severed. If the Oppenheimer dies, we die with her. We made our peace with that 15 years ago," Briggs gripped the console. "Captain, you just saved thousands of civilian lives. You saved this sector. You are heroes of the United Nations Space Command. Let us try." "There is no time, Arthur," Rook said, using the commander's first name. "And there is something you need to know, something we discovered out there in the dark." Briggs frowned, motioning for Jenkins to record the transmission. "Go ahead, Captain." "When we were lost in the Orion Nebula," Rook began, his audio feed stuttering as another secondary explosion rocked the Oppenheimer's hull. "We didn't just drift. Our sensory arrays were vastly enhanced by our digital state. We tapped into deep space telemetry. We intercepted the swarm's communication networks." Rook's voice dropped, carrying a chilling resonance. "Humanity thinks the swarm is an invasion force, a conqueror expanding its territory. You are wrong." "What are they then?" Briggs asked, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "They are refugees, Commander," Rook said. "They aren't expanding, they are fleeing. They threw themselves at our defenses because they are desperate. They are running from something worse." Riley and Jenkins exchanged terrified glances. The Swarm, a fleet that had effortlessly dismantled Earth's greatest armada, was merely running scared. "We saw the telemetry, Arthur," Rook continued. "Deep in the Perseus arm. Something ancient. Something that doesn't just conquer worlds. It consumes them. The Swarm was trying to clear a path through our space to escape it. But they are out of time. And so is humanity unless we prepare." "Captain, what are you saying?" Briggs demanded. "If there is a greater threat, we need your data. We need your tactical analysis. I am transmitting our complete sensory logs and predictive matrices to your mainframe now," Rook replied. The consoles on Outpost Echo lit up as petabytes of encrypted data flooded their servers. "Take this data to Earth. Tell the UNSC to stop building conventional fleets. Tell them to build monsters, because monsters are the only things that survive in the deep dark." "Captain, we are rerouting our remaining reactor power to the slip space drive," Rook interrupted. "We cannot jump back to Earth, but we have enough mass left for one final untargeted blind jump. We're going to the Perseus arm." Briggs stared at the heavily damaged dreadnought. "You're going to hunt them. The things that hunt the Swarm." "We are soldiers, Commander," Rook's voice was fading, subsumed by the roar of the Oppenheimer's failing reactor. "We don't know how to do anything else. The Oppenheimer still has teeth. We will buy humanity as much time as we can." The cerulean light of the slip space drive began to pool around the shattered remains of the dreadnought, erratic and unstable. "It has been an honor serving with you, Commander Briggs," Rook's voice whispered through the static, finally breaking into the unified ghostly chorus of his crew one last time. "Hold the line." The transmission cut to dead air. Without another word, the UNS Oppenheimer tore a jagged, violent hole in space-time. It didn't wait for a clean vector. It simply threw itself into the abyss, leaving behind a blinding flash of Cherenkov radiation and an empty, silent void. Briggs stood at the viewport for a long time, staring at the empty space where the ghosts of humanity had stood their ground. He looked at the massive data file downloading onto his console, the blueprint for survival, a warning from the dead. "Commander?" Riley asked softly, breaking the heavy silence. "Orders?" Briggs turned away from the stars, his eyes hardened with a new terrifying resolve. "Patch me through to UNSC High Command," Briggs said, his voice cold as the vacuum outside. "Tell them the 7th Fleet is gone, tell them Sector 7 holds, and tell them they need to start building bigger guns. And that concludes the epic saga of the UNS Oppenheimer. Will Earth heed the Ghost's warning and build the monsters needed to survive the encroaching dark? If this relentless tale of human defiance sent chills down your spine, smash that like button. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi lovers, and be sure to subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss a thrilling HFY adventure. Humanity's fight for survival is just beginning, and you won't want to miss it.